From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible for Change. We're having an exciting program in this segment. We're going to be dealing with the issue of the ending of the exploitation related to the extraction of natural resources here in Montana. Historically, starting with the development of mining and timber products related to mining back in the 18th or 19th century, our first Constitution was drafted by a convention headed by the Copper King, William A. Clark. And although that wasn't adopted because we didn't become a state, 5 years later we had a new Constitution adopted, and W.A. Clark was the president of that convention as well. And they crafted a Constitution that was very, very favorable to mining interests and to those who were extracting minerals. And the history of Montana has been that the resources were extracted, the money was gathered, and the money ran out of state and never came back again. That's maybe overly simplistic, but that's kind of what was happening. And that was part of the change that we had to take place during the crucible of change. After 75 years of this type of colonialism of Montana. So that's what we're going to be exploring today, the ending of that exploitation. And we have two fantastic guests with us today. We have a former representative Harrison Fagg from Billings. Harrison is an architect of some renown in Montana who began serving in 1969 and served for 18 years in the Montana Legislature, all during the period we're talking about here. And we're also joined by a former state representative, but mostly former state senator, Tom Towe of Billings. We have a Democrat, Tom Towe, a Republican, Harrison Fagg, reflective of the cooperation of the period for getting things done. Tom started in 1971 and served, with a minor break, served a total of 20 years in the Montana Legislature. So we have very seasoned representatives here who were right in the middle of the battle of changing us from a state that was exploited to one that could take advantage of its own resource extraction. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you, Evan.
Glad to have you here. Let me start off by just asking a general question. And we'll start with you, Harrison, and then to Tom. Give me your just quick but short reflection on what was it like to serve during that period of time? A lot of change took place, and you were right in the middle, but what was it kind of like as a legislator?
It was a real period of change. But the thing I think that was different than today, it was a period of friendships and working across the aisle and getting things done. We didn't have the issues. We had the issues, but we found an end and a way of meeting those issues. And it was a challenge every single day. We were going from one period of time, and we didn't really realize it, at least I didn't realize it, what a jump we were making in terms of the state of Montana, going from more of a colonial state to a progressive state. And this was the period we were in, and I frankly didn't recognize it at the time. Looking back on it now, I see it was really a period of change, and an awful lot of things happened.
Yeah, Tom, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that we happened to arrive in 1971. I think Harrison came about that same time.
69.
69, okay. And by that time, the stranglehold that the Anaconda Company, the copper company, held on the legislature had been broken. There was still some vestiges of it. It was still strong, but it wasn't like it used to be. It used to be, in order to introduce a bill, if you wanted it drafted, you'd better get it drafted well, or it'd be tossed out right away.
Or they drafted it.
And that, you went to the top floor of the Placer Hotel, where all the lawyers for the Anaconda Company were, and they would be delighted to draft it for you, and they would be happy to take care of it. There was always on the top floor of the Placer Hotel, there was always an opening. Anytime somebody was hungry, they could go up. There was always food available. There was people to talk with.
Liquid refreshments, perhaps?
Liquid refreshments in particular. That was pretty much gone by the time I got there in 1971. But the influence was still there. And as J. Kinsey Howard said, with the Montana Twins, the Anaconda Company and the Montana Power Company, the power company was gradually getting stronger and stronger, and it was really more the power company's situation by the time we got there.
But even in our time, Tom, they had the hospitality rooms.
But they did have the hospitality rooms.
The same kind of a deal. You'd go over after the session, anything you wanted, basically, from a sandwich to a drink, it was available.
I don't think I ever went to those.
No,
and I guess
you had one, Power Company, and Green Stamps. They had 3 rooms. Maybe they were closed down by the time you got there.
Now, we're dating ourselves when we talk about green stamps.
Yes, but, but there was the green stamp room.
but I think that one of the changes that was taking place is that there were a number of younger people, like in those days, Harris and I were both fairly young, and Dorothy Bradley and
Bob Brown came in then.
Bob Brown came in at that same time, and a whole bunch of others, a lot of young peoples that were there, and they didn't go for this kind of lobbying that used to prevail in the legislature. So that was another part of the whole atmosphere.
And when you drop the names, don't forget George Darrow. He was a stalwart. He was just a real solid legislator that really stood on principle and got things done.
Yeah, when I talk with people about the kind of changes we're talking about here that relate to natural resource extraction and environmental things, George's name always comes to the fore.
He was probably the leader of the thinkers, if I want to say it. He was very, very deep and had a real sense of reasoning and a great deal of ability.
He understood the environment and the environmental issues, and Leland Schoonover on the other side.
Yeah, Leland Schoonover.
I think Harrison was telling me earlier that he sat right beside George Darrow.
Yes, he's my
I was
seatmate.
privileged. My first session, I sat right in front of Leland Schoonover. Whenever I had something I didn't understand, I'd just turn around and say, "Leland, tell me about this." And it was that was huge. He just
like George Darrow. I said, "What are we going to do with the solid waste, George?" He said, "Dry gulches. We can fill them up." And then he said, "We'll get rid of the." This is George. He had a quick answer for everything.
Well, I will tell you that interesting how you both schooled on some veterans, but veterans who were very progressive in their thinking, and then also you were able to work with each other a lot. One of the great things about, you're both from Billings, different parties, but you worked together a lot, and that was one of the reasons why we were so happy we were able to get both of you at the table together.
Yeah, Tom redrafted a couple of my bills for me, I recall. We were having trouble getting them through, and he said, if you change here and you change there, I think we can get it passed. And that's we worked back and forth, and I think I helped him a couple of times on his bills when they were in conference committee, particularly.
That's right. Sure did.
But you played a real big role when Tom was, the introduction of the coal severance tax was there, because it was because of you that Tom got to be the lead on that, even though he wrote it all. Yeah, well, of course, that is an interesting twist, because we had the coal tax bill, and Orr Halverson had submitted a bill in the House, and Tom in the Senate. And by the time she was from Kalispell.
Yeah, she's from Kalispell. And she was a Republican, and Tom was a Democrat.
No, she was a Democrat.
Yeah.
Oh, she was a Democrat, too?
Yep,
That's right.
she was a Democrat.
Yeah, by the time I got to through conference committee, her bill and Tom's bill were identical, not a word different. And so we got into conference committee, well, who's going to get the sponsorship? Well, the House people wanted the House member to get it, and the Senate people wanted the Senate member to get it. And I was on the conference committee, and I said, well, why don't we just flip a coin? And we flipped heads, Tom and tails or something like that. The next day in the paper, the headline was, Fagg flips a coin for $60 million.
And it became Tom Tow's bill, which was good because
it
he
should
wrote
have been
it,
his
really.
bill. It should have been his bill, yes.
Yeah.
Because he certainly was the former.
I
He did all
spent
the
so
work.
much time working on that bill, and I worked with the Senate and made sure that the committees were all right and everything when I was on the committee on committees to pass that bill. But what happened was, I think Bill Christensen, who was also a Democrat, at that time the lieutenant governor, thought that when I put the coal tax in at 30%, that was too high.
Yeah.
That wouldn't go. And so he engineered Ora Halverson to put in a contrary bill that was lower, but it's virtually the same thing, same tax, same way. And then pretty soon Ora Halverson got all wrapped up in it herself, and it was just
There's no accounting for that. People do get engaged and involved and so on. But the 30% did pass.
It did.
And though a dozen years later it was reduced, but it did pass. And
it was reduced the year I got unelected.
Yeah. You weren't there to protect it. It is a very interesting thing. But let's not forget that during this period, what we did have was this new Constitution came in, and it had a quality of life side to it. That is, we're going to protect ourselves and make sure our resources are to the benefit of the people, and so on, and that helped set some tone. Even the legislators were not then, and then some of those folks left the con and ended up in the legislature.
That's right.
Well, I think the con made the big split. It went from one pole to another pole, and that opened the door for the things we did. I don't think we could have had the success we had at the time we had it. We had not the Constitution.
Well, the open meetings and the fact that every vote had to be recorded, and the fact that we had to allow people to come in when the committee went into executive session to take action on bills. A lot of people said, "Oh, that'll never work. Business doesn't work that way," but it worked just fine.
This was the public's business,
and it was the public's business, and that had an atmosphere through it. That made a big difference. That all came about because of the Constitution.
In our segment of the constitutional discussion in the series, we have a discussion of the legislative article with Arlene Reichert and Jerry Lindorf and Rich Bechtel. And it's a marvelous discussion, and I hope everyone who's watching this gets a chance to look at that, because it covers those issues very well. Right. Now, let's talk, perhaps the coal was the driving immediate issue. The coal tax and then the coal trust fund in sequence. The tax came first, isn't that right?
Yes. Well, it virtually came the same time, but it was by days, it was the coal tax.
The tax went first.
The tax went first. That was a bill that was passed through the legislature, but at the same time that was passed, we also put in a bill to put onto the ballot at the next general election a constitutional provision that created the coal tax trust. And that passed at the next general election, took effect about the same time as the coal tax.
Now, the people voted overwhelmingly for that, for the coal trust fund.
That's right.
And there were some really, if you think about legacy, and you gentlemen both created a lot of legacy when you were in the legislature. One of the preeminent legacies that was created was this trust fund. And it has sustained itself over time and is now nearly $1 billion.
About $1 billion, John.
And, well, perhaps I could tell a little story about that, because at the time and during when I wrote the argument before for the voter information pamphlet on its adoption, and then after that time, when I defended it in Congress, when I defended it in speeches all over the country, I was asked to come and talk about the coal trust and the coal tax. But I used to say this, that that the people of Montana were used to exploitation by the mineral companies, the mining companies. And as you mentioned in your opening, that was very true. The mining companies were very, very dominant. The original Constitution did not allow the legislature to pass a tax on minerals. and fortunately, Joe Dixon corrected that back in the 1920s, but he lost the election for governor in order to do it. But by the time we got there, there was still a problem. And I used to say this many times, that the people of Montana were very much aware that we are the treasure state. We have minerals that are very valuable. But we have allowed those minerals to be mined and taken, and what do we have to show for it? What do we have now that the copper, the greatest hill on earth, is virtually mined out? What do we have left? Now, I looked around, and even the copper kings, the people who became fabulously wealthy, William Clark, Marcus Daly, Heinze, all these other people, they didn't leave things to Montana. I looked around and I found that William Clark endowed the Los Angeles Symphony Orchestra. William Clark built the library at Stanford University. William Clark built the law school at the University of Virginia. The Corcoran Art Gallery, one of the greatest art galleries in the world in Washington, D.C., was all started by William Clark. And what do we have to show for that? The only thing I could find is that William Clark gave $20,000 to build a theater inside the walls of the state prison. And I said, and I've since learned that, yeah, William Clark gave a little money to the University of Montana too. But I kept telling people that the people of Montana were aware of that, and they were not about to let that happen again.
Well,
and
in
for
fact,
that reason,
yeah,
we wanted to set something aside for the future generations, so we could look our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren in the eye and say, we allowed the mining of coal, but we did not squander your inheritance. We have something to show for it. It's that billion-dollar trust fund that can't be touched in the principle, but all of the income is available every year for the legislature to use to help Montanans.
To make it current and topical in this sense, in addition to what you looked at, we've all in the last little while had a chance to reflect upon what W.A. Clark's daughter, Huguette Clark, who recently died at about 104 or something, and is the subject of that book, Empty Mansions, has huge, unbelievable estates all over this country,
and not used.
And not even used, and yet what we kind of had was a hill in Butte that was decimated and an environment that was decimated, and all the money went out of state. Yeah. And
I have said many times that I felt that Montana, before the 70s, Montana was really a colony. We were, even though we were given statehood status, we were really a colony. People were exploiting the colony of Montana, particularly in the mineral area. And I think with the coal tax in particular, but also with a lot of other bills that got passed in the 70s, we broke that copper collar. We became our own state, and we no longer are allowing, with a 30% coal tax, we are no longer allowing the exploitation for benefit of other people, not the people of Montana.
You know, one of the things, you know, if you take a look at it and you say, well, we got jobs. Montana got jobs. So at one point, the Anaconda Company signed 3/4 of the paychecks in the state of Montana. Okay. So we were always, I think, as a state, grateful for the jobs, but that was only one side of the equation. This lack of reinvestment in Montana in either the infrastructure or the niceties of the culture of Montana was one of the challenges. So we had this trust fund, and it's emblematic. Now let's talk a little bit about what you did with the trust fund, because you did have a tax, and ultimately the constitutional amendment to create the trust said half of the tax had to go into the trust fund.
Right.
And once in there, could only be spent if it had a vote. The corpus, it could only be spent.
Principle. Mm-hmm.
The principle of it could only be spent if it was 3/4 of each house of the legislature voted to spend it. And so that is a high barrier, and that has actually protected that trust fund from what is a continual assault of people who say, I'm looking, if I don't want to raise your taxes by 5 cents, I'll go take it from the trust fund. And that's been the challenge of decades challenge.
Every single governor since the coal tax was passed, every Republican governor has tried to bust the trust, either capping it or taking money out of it or in some other way pulling money out of the trust fund in order to fund general government.
And they couldn't break that 3/4.
Well, the 3/4, that's really mission impossible. To get 3/4 of the legislature to decide on something.
It happened
don't
once.
forget,
That one little small thing.
It's happened more than once. It's happened several times.
It can happen, but
on
it's
water
pretty difficult.
projects, we have said, okay, it's with a really minor thing only to support the bonds if the bonds are default or something. But we have busted the trust, if you want to put it that way, with a 3/4 vote of each house of the legislature on several occasions, if it's really justified. It generally
But everyone
is not.
agreed on those
Everybody
because they
agreed.
were general and small. They were not
It was
big.
small and
Well,
very
we're on
little.
the subject. The person that's protected the trust as much as any is Werner Bertelsen. He's a fighter to keep the trust as it
And
is.
a Republican.
And a Republican, yes.
And he was chairman of the Montanans for the Coal Trust. It was organized for the specific purpose of protecting that trust.
And he's at the legislature every time there's an attack on it, and he doesn't leave until it's over with.
And I hope he can do it again.
I hope so too. He's getting along in
Well,
years.
we'd hope it wouldn't be unresolved, but I think it speaks to vision, not just commitment, to vision and understanding that you have to write into the Constitution and into laws protections. That just the idea that, well, this is so worthwhile it'll be protected inherently just doesn't work.
Virtually every other state that's had a trust fund has lost their trust fund, with one exception, Alaska. And that's because they did not protect it like we did. We had another trust fund, by the way. We had a trust fund that was created out of the coal tax pie for higher education. Higher education in Montana has never had its own trust fund or separate income. The schools K through 12 have the school lands to help support the schools. Nothing is there to support the higher education. We put 20% of the coal tax into a higher educational trust fund. But guess what? We didn't protect it with the Constitution. And I can remember on the floor in 1985, in the last session, there was an attempt to raid it. And that was because a bunch of Democrats from Butte thought we ought to build a library at Montana Tech with some of that money. and it passed on the third reading, but I noticed that one of the parties from Butte was not in their chair. I jumped up and said, Mr. President, I think there may be somebody here that's button got pushed even though they're not in the presence of the legislature, the Senate. And the president agreed with me, and I think we better vote again. And we did, and it lost by 1 vote. So it was protected. The next year, I was out of the legislature. They took the whole trust fund, and it's gone.
I think it speaks to the fact that we need to have statutes, constitutional language, and committed individuals to try to defend these kind of things that are.
And a committed legislature. I was told one time the legislature was like a man looking through a keyhole with blinders on, and very shallow vision, and we forget the wide vision.
Yeah.
And I think this is where we fall down as a legislature. Too many of us in the legislature are concerned about the next election. We're not concerned about the state of Montana, and that's why people like Tom that could see vision made a difference.
And I've always tried to get people to raise their eyes a little bit, look at the future. I mean, this is not just the next election, it's what's going to happen to the state of Montana in the future.
Well, right now, every legislature that meets should, send a thank you note to the legislators of your time, because the amount of interest that comes out of
It's a
the
huge
full
amount of
trust
money,
fund
yeah.
that is then
Huge
appropriate. That can be appropriated by the legislature. Far exceeds the amount of money collected in coal tax.
That's right.
Yes.
At the present time, there is more money from the interest income of the trust fund than there is coal tax money itself. Every year.
It speaks to the vision and the wisdom. Now, there was another trust that was passed at about the same time, but it was not done in the same manner, and that was
That's
the Resource
RIT.
Indemnity Trust, the RIT. And Governor Schwinden, in his film that he did with us, talked about how he had kind of come up with this idea and talked to Forrest Anderson about it, who said, you better talk to Tom Judge, he's the new governor. And they liked it, and they put it in, and it did pass, but it was different. And because of that, it hasn't had the impact. Can you speak to?
There were several things that were different. One of the major things is it was a small amount. It was only, I think, 5%, but it was broader. It was on every mineral, not just coal. 5% for the Resource Indemnity Trust, 30% for the coal tax. You can see the difference. And the trust fund was not nearly as big, but because it pulled for more...
But it affected oil, too.
It affected oil, it affected hard rock minerals, it affected all minerals, everything. And there was one other major difference, and that was there was an automatic cap on it. At the time it hit $100 million, it stops. So that didn't happen with the coal tax. The coal tax goes on and on and on forever.
I remember when, it might have been late, when late in your career, it may have been afterwards, I'm trying to remember when they were reaching that 100 million figure. And the question became, well, why don't we raise that? Because look at what's happening with the Coal Trust Fund. Right. And I remember a senator from the Billings who fought arduously to keep it at the 100 million, and it was really the oil companies saying, look, don't make us have to pay any more tax. I sometimes look at things and I don't know. But nonetheless, it stayed at 100 million. So it's had good impact.
It has, and it's been doing very well.
But it
really good things.
Was limited. Think about if it was twice as big.
It was good, but it could have been better, is what you're saying.
So, you know, as they say, those who do not learn from history are condemned to repeat it. It's worth noting the difference between those two, and one is a home run, and the other one's maybe a line drive single or maybe a double.
Might be a double.
That's probably a good illustration.
Yeah.
The other thing that you haven't mentioned, and I think probably needs to be into this discussion, is the impact that coal itself had on all of the other environmental issues that many of which were
And
passed.
coal was the evolving resource. The demand now for coal at that time at least was targeted to be pretty big.
The North Central Power Study came out in the early 70s. It was about the time of the 73 session. Everybody was aware of it, and some government agency, and I don't remember which one it was, but had done this real big study that showed because of all the coal, and by the way, we have a lot of the coal in the world. We have something like 10% of the world's coal supply.
10% of the world and 30% of Americans.
25% of the coal supply of the United States. 52% of the low sulfur coal in the United States is right here in Montana. And people were much aware of that, and this North Central Power Study came up showing there were going to be power plants all over eastern Montana.
I think the projected number was 70 power plants, which never happened, by the way.
Which never happened, but everybody was concerned.
Yeah.
And what happened in the legislature, there was one bill introduced in the House that said we should not allow coal mining, period. And because of all the impacts and all the problems. Then the most significant bill, I think, in this whole thing, was Dorothy Bradley's bill on a coal moratorium. She said, we're going to allow coal mining, but we don't have the environmental laws in place yet. We don't have the tax in place. We don't have all of these, the condemnation things in place yet. So let's
take a break.
Take a break. Let's put a moratorium. Let's stop the mining until we can do all of these things. Well, that was an interesting bill. It came to the floor of the House, and I'm sure you can remember, Harrison, it was tied. We couldn't get enough votes to pass it, but we couldn't get enough votes to kill it, so it just stayed there. And then pretty soon somebody came up with the idea, well, let's just set it on the shelf. We'll just put it up there. It's always there. It can be brought down at any time. And let's see if we can get some of these other bills all passed. And if we can show some good progress, then we can leave that alone. If we don't, then we still have the option of bringing it down. That worked. That exactly happened, and that's when we got a clean air bill, we got a clean water bill, we got a subdivision, a strip mine law passed, we got Harrison's bill passed on hard rock reclamation, and although we didn't get it that session, at the next session we got the coal tax. So all of those happened primarily, I think, because people were concerned about the Northwest coal study, but also they were concerned that Montana had the laws that were necessary to control the development so it would take place at our beck and call and not at the exploited corporations' beck and call.
At the time, that concept of 70 coal plants in eastern Montana, there was one of the company guys came and said, would you like to have us build 10 cities of 20,000 each or one city of 200,000 in eastern Montana? What would be your preference? Well, now we ended up having Colstrip built, and it's only a few thousand, but that was the sense of it at that time.
That's right.
And in fact,
it was expected to be a lot bigger than it was.
And so that threat really made people focus. And the threat was not just the coal development, but the water. Tenneco, as you recall, was the company that was up here starting to appropriate water because of the huge water demands of that type of thing. And so as a result of that, I think everyone was intently focused on this idea of, well, if we're going to do it, we ought to at least do it right. To do that, we have to have these tools. And I think that's maybe one of the differences that emerged out of that period, and is constantly a challenge even today, is how do you responsibly develop resources, get the economic advantage of it, but not destroy the quality of life that we have in Montana. Now, you and people who were working at that period knew that you probably could do both if you work at it and do it right. There are some folks who still maintain it's an either or proposition. You either got to have hell-bent all the jobs and no good reclamation or no good environmental protections, or the people who say it's all about this, you can't mine, you can't do this because we got to protect completely. The balance is where we end up if I think Montana's at their best, are to do it right, but do it right.
And I think we did a good balance in the early 70s. I think the legislature was fortunate to have the people who were concerned about that sufficient to get, I think, a very good balance, so we can say that we can look our future generations in the eye and said, we didn't squander your inheritance. We didn't mess up the environment so bad that nobody wants to live here anymore. It could have happened.
I think the hard rock mining bill that we talked about a minute ago was an example of this. It became so apparent we needed some type of hard rock mining legislation, and people were saying, well, it can't be done, and it needs an interim study. And well, I went to the head of the mining industry and asked him to send a man to me, a lawyer, and went to the head of the Forest Service and said, you send over a man that can sit down and draft a bill. I got the two people together from both sides, and I said, I had a committee chairmanship then. I said, I've got a committee office. I'm going to want you guys to go in that office and don't come out until you have a bill. And it was written jointly between the industry and the environmentalists, and it's worked out to be quite well. I'm sure it's been amended since it was passed, but I think it's worked out quite well.
Tell us about the trigger for that, your little hike up on a plateau that helped drive that.
It is a kind of an interesting story. I have done a lot of backpacking and mountain climbing in my life, and one of my trips was to the Mount Wood Plateau, which overlooks the Stillwater Valley and overlooks the mining industry work down below. And as I was walking up what used to be a trail, it was now a road. It was a jeep trail, but a road all the way to the top of the plateau. And I thought that was peculiar. I got up on top, and walked out on the plateau, and it's just my uncle called it the golf course. It was just a beautiful plateau up there. There were cat tracks all over scarring the plateau, and there had been one little tree, probably 2 feet high, and somebody had chopped it down, and for no apparent reason whatsoever. Well, I took the picture of the tree.
It must have been in the way of those vehicles.
Yeah, it had to be in the way of those bulldozers. But a little tree like that, I'm sure, took 20 years to grow, maybe 30 years to grow.
Yeah, because you're way above the timber line.
We're way above the timber, yeah. And it chopped it off. So I took a picture of the tree, and that was part of my lobby, too. I would take these people and say, this wasn't necessary. Don't you think we should do something about the hard rock mining in Montana? And at that time, we had a little difficulty getting it to pass, but it did pass. And it passed primarily because Mary Donahoe, who was the county commissioner of Stillwater County, she called Bill McKay, who was a state senator, and said, Bill, they got this bill out of the House, you get it out of the Senate. And that's how it happened.
Yeah, and Bill was a Republican
Bill was
from
a
Carbon
Republican.
County and Stillwater County.
Right, exactly.
And his family stayed engaged in kind of progressive development and ranching.
But in those days, we didn't have the barrier between the Democrats and Republicans. I think that close friends from both sides, we'd go out party together, we travel together, we'd sit and visit together, I go up to the legislature and I don't see that environment, and it's appalling.
Yeah, and I would echo that. At the time that I served in the legislature, we had great respect for the people on the other side of the aisle. We might have disagreed, we might have argued with them. We'd argue in the committees, we'd argue on the floor. We would go as much as we could to make the best argument we could, but we had great respect, and we really enjoyed visiting with it. I for instance, my wife and I went to Bob Brown's wedding when he got married in Forsyth. We drove all the way over there just because I had that respect for some of the other people in the legislature. And I can remember Bill Mathers, who was the principal opponent of the coal tax.
Right.
He supported the tax, but he thought it was at 30% was way too high, and he did everything he could to get that reduced. And Walter Olmert from Miles City also did. But I have greatest respect for both of those gentlemen, even though we fought as hard as we could on the issues. Yeah. And why can't they do that today?
I don't know, when
More
I was up
civility.
there, Senator James, when he brought me into the legislature, said, remember one thing, he said, that your biggest enemy today on the floor will be your friend tomorrow. He said,
That's right. That's right.
And they seem to have forgotten that lesson. Is that,
Well, I think it's fair to say that the legislature, when you gentlemen were there, was a big contrast with the past, the first 75 years.
Huge.
But also a contrast with the present.
Yeah, let me tell you another story, because when you talk about the past, well, actually two stories.
Okay.
The first one took place in 1901 when Heinze, who was the third Copper King, had this great idea of the apex theory, that if the copper vein came up to the surface on your land, you could follow that as long as you wanted, as far as it goes. And it was just making
that actually was the law, but it was the application of that law by the local judges that Heinze owned,
Clancy. Right.
Judge Clancy, that led to this problem. And then
Correct.
all of a sudden we had what?
Well, what happened was the Anaconda Company and Marcus Daly's company was getting just terribly frustrated and getting taken because they were losing all of their copper. And so they went to the governor and asked Governor Towe if he would call a special session of the legislature, and in order to pass a bill that would allow for
changing judges,
excusing the venue disqualifying a judge. And Toole said, "No, this is a government. A private company can't come in and do things like that. We aren't going to do that for a private company. No, we can't do that." And they said, all right, all right. And as you pointed out earlier, the Anaconda Company controls something like 2/3 to 3/4 of all the paychecks in the state, all the non-farm laborers in the state. And they pulled the lockout.
They shut her up.
Shut the doors. And about a month later, 40 days later, Governor Toole said, well, I guess maybe we better do that. And they called a special session of the legislature.
Can you imagine the economic stranglehold that
And the Anaconda Company had ruled the state for the next 50 years, maybe 70 years. And that was the case. The second story, to illustrate that and how much of a stranglehold the Anaconda Company had. K. Ross Toole tells me this story. K. Ross Toole said, and this is in his doctoral thesis, but not in any of his books. But you can go to the University of Montana and get his doctoral thesis. Actually, he was the director of the Historical Society in 1947. And he says that they needed some kind of a reproduction machine. It was a fairly big machine. That was before we had all these fancy copying machines, you know. And he needed something really bad for the Historical Society, and it would cost a few $1,000s. It was a significant amount of money. He went through all the procedures. He got it into the governor's budget. He went into House Bill 1, House Bill 2, and he went through the committees and supported it on the committee floor, on the floor of the committees before it got to the floor of the House. He finally got a chance to visit with the lobbyist for the Anaconda Company. And he sat down with the lobbyist of the Anaconda Company and went through all the arguments of why it was so important, why we had to have this, why a few dollars would be well spent. And the Anaconda Company lobbyist said, okay, go ahead, we'll support you. He said, he went out and purchased the machine. He didn't even wait for it to go through the legislature and be signed by the governor. It was already done.
He knew the deal was done. He knew the deal was done.
That's how big a stranglehold the company had on this state. That's broken. It was starting to be broken in the 60s. In the 70s, it was totally broken.
I think it's not just the Anaconda Company. I think the period of the 70s is the period where the lobbyists took a back seat. When I first went to the legislature, everybody went to the lobbyist and they asked their opinion. There was a handful of them, 4 or 5 guys up there that really told us how to vote, or told the people how to vote. As this transition began, as you said, from a colony to a state, and that's a good description, I think there was a transition with how the lobbyists and their input took in the legislature. And we didn't listen to them like we did at one time. And although there will always be those that don't vote until they talk to the lobbyists, the bulk of the legislators, at least when I was there, were going on their own thinking, and they were talking things through between themselves, and they're talking inter-party, and they're talking in their caucus as to what the vote should be, not how the lobbyists thought the vote should be. And I think there's a major transition in the 70s.
Yeah, and let me tell you a little bit more about that. The Anaconda Company did a very good job of lobbying, as you might well imagine. And then the Montana Power Company, as Jim Kinsey
they were
Howard,
excellent.
They kind of took their place. In fact, by the time I got to the legislature,
when the trajectory of the Anaconda Company was going down, it was
Montana Power Company was
going
going up, and Montana Power Company was becoming even more important. Montana Power Company had a lobbyist for the Republican legislators. They had a lobbyist for the Democratic legislators. That lobbyist for the Democratic legislators would make the round after the election, go talk to every single one in their hometowns.
The Republicans did the same thing.
And the Republicans, I'm sure, did the same thing. They were really on top of things and had a huge influence. And that is significant, because what happened at this point, because of the coal tax bill, something really dramatic happened that was almost an accident or a fluke. It just so happened that the Montana Power Company's main lobbyist, John Lahr, got involved in a slander suit because he called the radio station the Sunday before election and said that Bob Harper, a Democrat who he was trying to defeat, voted for a contraceptive bill in his Catholic district, which was wrong. And we sued him. Bob Harper came to me and asked me to bring his suit. We sued the Montana Power Company and John Lahr. That suit was pending at the time we met in 1975 for the legislature, and John Lahr was just devastated. He just wasn't acting like he normally would. And the Coal Council hadn't yet been organized. There was no effective lobby for the coal companies, and the consequence is that because of that in the lobbying area, we were able to get the coal tax
Well, and I
passed.
think that the tone was also set by the CON, which told lobbyists you had to disclose how much you spend and what you do.
It had a big bearing.
A number of things like that. Now, let me ask you this, before we get off the hard rock mining completely. In addition to it, the Hard Rock Mining Act doing the reclamation issues and things like that, it also had a mechanism for helping communities deal with the impacts of startup. And in fact, our biggest mine in Montana today, the Stillwater Mine, which has about 1,800 current employees, was developed under the scenario that you put into that bill. And because of that, won many almost environmental awards, but it was an evidence of when you make the companies deal with the communities on the front end, there are ways to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's the story of mining is a boom and a bust. The mine comes in and there's a huge boom. You see it right now in the Stillwater Valley. There are extra schoolrooms are necessary. There's extra bars. There's extra restaurants. There's every influx of people. That Stillwater mining is going to leave, and there has to be a way to compensate for it. And we did cover that in the bill. I mean, the bill was comprehensive. It started out with the exploration and went through the mining, and then it went through the reclamation and went through the after effects of the reclamation. And again, it was a bill that I take pride in the fact that it was written by both sides of the fence. They both saw the need, and it's too bad we can't have more of that today.
And the companies paid for it.
And the companies pay for it, yes.
That was the stalwart thing of the bill. The companies actually paid through fees. Now, I maintain that one of the reasons they were willing to do that is because I had a bill that was ready to tax them, much like the coal tax, and they were afraid of it. And so they went and said, oh, we'll take care of all those things right away in your bill. And
that very well could have, but they took care of all of it. I know that.
Yeah, and I think the fact that there's 1,800, 1,900 workers down there in a mine, paychecks, good economy. Of course, it is underground, which helps. That helps with reclamation, but nonetheless, the Stillwater Mine is maybe a poster child.
It is a poster child. I've got a cabin 3 miles from the mine. You would not know they're even there. They've done a beautiful job. They're doing a great job in reclamation. I think the Stillwater Protective Association may have something to do about that, but they have done a wonderful job in the way they've reclaimed, the way they mined, the way they've taken care of. They're running buses back and forth rather than have the employees drive up, for example. They have many things they're doing that are progressive.
And it takes the steam out of the argument that somehow this stuff is punitive, and that if you pass these laws, you'll stop everything. It's always good to turn to a Stillwater mine and say, "See, it does work." And
well,
they have a great community organization. They work with the community. They listen to the community. They help with the community in all ways. They are doing their best to be a good citizen, and I think people appreciate that.
They meet regularly with environmentalists in the valley. They've been very cognizant of the environment. They're doing a remarkable job.
But there's one thing is missing.
What's that?
And that is we haven't put enough money aside for future generations. Once that platinum and palladium is gone,
it's gone.
It's gone forever. It'll never come back.
And
our future generations won't have any part of that.
I think the two of you ought to rise up and create a trust fund out of hard rock mineral.
Well, there's a more important one to do, and that is oil.
Yeah.
Right now.
Now let me ask us to dive into something before we finish up. We've got a while to go here yet, but still, and that is facility siting, because with the threat of the technical water consumption of the 70 plants in eastern Montana, and which got so big a cause that Ross Toole quit writing history books and wrote a book called The Rape of the Great Plains, projecting what would happen, discussing the past and so on. And out of that, a Facility Siting Act was passed, which had fairly significant and continues to have significant impact in terms of if things are going to happen, how should they happen? You guys
I took an interest in that and tried to do something about it, didn't get very far, but Francis Bardenow did. He had a real concern that this needs to be taken care of. We need to make sure that we're going to protect the environment if we let a power plant come in, that the community is taxed properly, the community doesn't suffer economically. And he introduced the Plant Siting Act, which was a major piece of legislation. Didn't come in until the '75 session. So that was after the moratorium. They didn't get the Plant Siting Act until later, but we did get it in '75. '75 was a great year as well. And what happened in the Plant Siting Act was really quite remarkable, because it really did make sure that the people were protected and that the companies had to pay for their impact on the environment. Now, a lot of people have since said that that's really impeding further development, and there has been a huge change in the Plant Siting Act since Francis was no longer in the legislature. But
well, you know, it has expanded to include certain size pipelines and certain length pipelines and certain size transmission lines, as well as the actual plants themselves. It's always under assault. I mean, I think it's worth, one of the subtitles of this series is how we've moved from a corporate colony to a citizen-oriented state, and the challenge of keeping it that way.
Yeah.
And
well, I recognize there has to be a balance. There has to be a balance in jobs on the one hand.
Well, but that's
and
why the legislature needs to create the balance. I think they've been pretty fair about doing that. But I think the thing we're talking about is the pace we set in the '70s, and I think that made a major imprint as we went forward. And I know Francis Bardenow, Harold Gerke, another great legislator, was active in the Black Plant Siting. I was a co-sponsor of the bill. There are just a lot of things that were happening those days, but it's always going to be under attack. And the argument you brought up a minute ago, it's always going to stop development. You'll always hear that. And a good bill does not stop development.
Well, and it's always driven by economics, and you know, if you have an insatiable desire for the bottom line to be bigger no matter what, there is a social responsibility to those. We have a social compact with each other in a state that we will do it in a way that benefits as many people as possible, not just rip and run. But we can't build a fence around Montana. No, but you know, we also can't rip and run and take off and leave nothing.
But the Stillwater mine has got a huge, not a huge, but a large herd of mountain sheep that live down there in winter on the mine, and they just love it.
Right across the road from your cabin.
That's right across the road.
That's
They're
right.
down there every year.
The most sheep I've ever seen right there.
About 30 or 40 sheep. There's many of that.
And I had a cabin down there once too, and my cabin burned and your cabin burned. You rebuilt yours. I never did mine.
That's right. But there again, it shows that a good legislature will allow development and allow reclamation and allow the future. And it opens the door also, as I say, for the mountain sheep in this case.
Well, I mean, this period that we're talking about, with hard rock mining, with Resource Indemnity Trust, the coal tax itself, the Facility Siting Act, and numerous other bills, was a fairly remarkable period.
Yeah, but why it was so remarkable, I hate to see the program end without saying this, it's because the Democrats and Republicans worked together. Yeah. We were friends, and we commonly saw Montana, we saw what needed to be done, and although we argued vigorously, you and I have argued on many cases, we've always remained very close friends, and at the time, we worked together for the good of the state.
And I would say one thing further. In those early days, the real impetus for some of the environmental bills came from the Republicans. It was George Darrow and it was Harrison Fagg that were working on these things. And yes, we went in and supported it, and that's how it got passed.
And another thing that we did is, so we haven't talked on the conference committees, how important they are. The bill is passed, and all of a sudden it goes to conference committee you get the final bill. And it was so key that the Democrats and Republicans worked together on the conference committees. And I don't know that that's happening today, and I hate to say that I think we've taken a step backwards.
And I would echo that. I would echo that.
You know, it's good to remember that the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency federally, is a creature of one Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Yep.
Well,
Okay.
Montana.
But that's an important thing to know when you talk about the kind of bipartisan sense that we need to make sure we do things right when we deal with environment and jobs together.
That was one of the first things that came out of the 70s. 1971, George Darrell wrote the Montana Environmental Protection Act.
Right.
And he got that passed. That was one of the first things that we did in the 70s. That was important.
So again, that speaks to the bipartisan nature,
Yeah.
which
It's
you know,
Republican. That's
and
right.
because Republicans were putting up good bills, Democrats were putting up good bills, people were working together. Now, I don't want to overstate this like it's nirvana back in the 70s.
No.
But you're right, there were big fights on other policy issues.
And then
But-
on the environment, too. We argued, but we came to a conclusion jointly.
I should probably tell you a little bit more about the coal tax itself. I introduced the coal tax in the 1974 session. I introduced a bill in the 73 session, didn't go anywhere. In the 74 session, I introduced a major bill, and it didn't go very far either. I think we did get it out of the House, but we never got it through the Senate. There were some problems with it. There were issues, and that was put into an interim study where we always have equal Democrats and equal Republicans. And they picked those committees very well. Bill Mathers was on that, Walter Ulmer was on it, and I was on it, Ora Halverson was on it. What happened was we worked all the details out in that committee. We were able to provide, we came up with a bill that was not controversial at all, with one exception: the amount of the tax. And we argued over that. We didn't argue over how it was to be levied, how it was to be handled, or any of the mechanics. It was FOB mine. We haven't talked about that. That's another issue. But we made sure that it was that it was a percentage of the price that the coal companies got for the tax when they sold the coal. And I was told that that was because they used an FOB mine price. And that's what we put in the law.
And it passed. Like I said, decade and a half later, it went down some, but in the meantime, it has always been under assault in terms of Supreme Court challenge, the U.S. Supreme Court, challenges in the Congress. And so you kind of think, well, maybe I was doing something right here when it was all put together. But economic interests always want to challenge that. At least 30% is to 15.
It was challenging the courts, and Mike Greeley defended it. He was the Attorney General at that point. He was it was in 75 session and voted for it, and then he defended it in the courts and went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. We won in the Supreme Court. Then they went to Congress and they tried to get a bill passed which would limit the amount of taxes that anybody could levy and any state could levy. And I went back to Washington many times.
We got a coal oversight committee. I went back many times too.
And Dorothy Bradley came and joined me once, and we visited many congressmen and their offices, congresswomen.
Well, it does speak to
we succeeded in getting that bill killed. We did hire a lobbyist. Mike Billings eventually took it over and lobbied on behalf of the state of Montana.
Now you said Mike. I want to ask you, did you mean Leon?
No,
It was Mike Billings.
No, it was Mike.
From here, not his brother who worked for Muskie?
I think that's correct. It was not Leland, no.
Oh, okay.
But at any rate, it was. We defended that in Congress, and we succeeded. And then the coal companies came to the state legislature and tried to bust the trust.
Now
So
we're
we're
going to have to wrap up here. Let me just take 10 seconds and say one other thing that we'll try to cover in our taxation stuff on another program, which is the movement from a net proceeds tax on minerals and coal to a gross minerals to a gross proceeds tax, which meant a lot. And that was one of the bills that we haven't had a chance to cover here. We're running out of time. It always happens that there's so much to cover, and you know there's nothing better than being in my position where I get the chance to have a conversation, which we do as friends who've known each other for many years, have a conversation with really smart, good people. And it's a pleasure to have been at this table with both of you. We look back on it again, a period when we're talking about coal severance tax, we're talking about the coal trust fund, we're talking about the resource indemnity trust, hard rock mining, facility siting, taxes on gross proceeds. All of this stuff occurred and more in a period of joint cooperation in Montana, a period of progressive change. A remarkable story in the history of Montana. Both of you, big players in that history. And those of us and those in the future who look at this series on In the Crucible of Change will always be thinking about the role that you played in it. And thank you so much for being here. And for all of you, thank us for joining us in the Crucible of Change. We'll see you on the next show.